What does science today say about the plausibility of a historical Adam and Eve?
We have a research project on that. It's not specifically around the biblical concept of Adam and Eve, but could human beings have originated from a two-parent breeding pair? And there is actually a section in the Theistic Evolution book on this current research that's being done about this genomically. And until recently, there was a study by Francisco Ayala that people took as sort of gospel. A lot of theologians were told that science had settled the issue, that there was humans at best might have emerged from a group of 10,000 hominids or something. Actually, very recently been established by a research team that we've been supporting and conceded by members of the Biologos Foundation, who are theistic evolutionists, that the genomics is perfectly consistent with a two-parent origin for anatomically modern humans. That's us. There's debates about how long ago that would have taken place, but the genomics is consistent with that model. And there'll be a lot more coming out on that. That's an active area of research that some of our genomics and genetics people are working on. Ann Gager is the key scientist working on that, molecular biologist. And much of that research is in the Theistic Evolution book for people who want to read more on it.
And again, that book available, you can find it on the web at equip.org. One major question I want to ask you, and that is whether or not you think it's true, obviously this is a bit rhetorical, that there is a 98% similarity between human DNA and
oh my
chimp
goodness,
DNA.
Don't even get me started on this. This is the worst science in the world. Yeah, so many things to say. The first, there is a high degree of sequence similarity of many proteins of humans and chimps. The sequence similarity will probably be settling in the low 90s. Right now, I think the best estimate is about 95%, not 98%. But there are multiple layers of fallacy in this. The first is that DNA is not all of what it takes to build an animal form. DNA builds the proteins, and proteins do not an animal make. And so we have low-level informational modules that are quite similar to the low-level informational modules that are in chimps and other animals. In fact, we have high degree of sequence similarity, a lot of different things. Our sequence similarity is closer to chimps, that's true, than others. But the 95% similarity is not at all impressive to computer programmers because they also use informational modules, and they reuse them in lots of different ways. And the low-level code gets reused in very different applications. And so the difference that makes a difference is often a very small amount of code. So that's one thing to point out, because the difference that makes a difference is often the higher-level codes that's telling the lower-level modules how to be arranged. And what we now know about the junk DNA is that the non-coding regions of the DNA are functioning. They're not the residuum of a long trial and error process of mutation and selection. They are functional, the non-coding regions, and they are functioning to regulate the timing and expression of the coding modules, the parts of the DNA that build for proteins. So we have a lot of things we're learning about how small bits of code can make a big difference, or about how regulatory code can coordinate the use of the parts of the code that get compared, like our hemoglobin molecules that capture oxygen in the bloodstream are highly similar to those of monkeys. I think they may be 100% similar. They do the exact same job, but when such proteins get turned on and turned off is an entirely different matter. So the regulatory DNA is very different between chimps and humans, and that makes a big difference. In addition, we have what's called epigenetic or ontogenetic information that's necessary for body plan construction that is not the same and is not even measured because we don't have a good way of measuring that yet between chimps and humans. In addition, there's a paper that's just come out or coming out soon in our top biology journal, Biocomplexity, by a young computer scientist who's showing that the way in which computer scientists use and reuse modules of code, in the computer science it's called a dependency graph, and the dependency graph model does a much better job of explaining both the similarities and the differences in code that we find in chimps and humans than a standard Darwinian tree model. So looking at code from a computer science point of view gives a much better description and explanation of the patterns we see in the code, which is a design-based way of looking at things rather than the, simple similarity points to common ancestry argument. Sorry for such a long answer. I told you not to get me going.
I wanted to get you go on that, actually. But here's one other thing I was just thinking about, and that is something that Thomas Nagel said. He's a noted atheist philosopher, of course. He said that defenders of intelligent design deserve our gratitude. His quote goes on to say that even though writers like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer are motivated, at least in part, by their religious beliefs, the empirical arguments they offer against the likelihood that the origin of life and its evolutionary history can be fully explained by physics and chemistry are of great interest in themselves. Another skeptic, David Berlinski, has brought out these problems vividly without reference to the design inference, even if one is not drawn to the alternative of an explanation by the actions of a designer. The problems that these iconoclasts pose for the orthodox scientific consensus must be taken seriously. They do not deserve the scorn with which they are commonly met. It is manifestly unfair. How cool is that?
Yeah, it was very cool. I mean, he's an eminence in the American Academy and leading philosopher of science, NYU. He's been very clear about his own worldview. He's said, I had a wonderful lunch with him in New York, and he said that he simply doesn't want the universe to be the kind of place in which there is a person such as God. He's temperamentally inclined towards atheism, but he's seen the force of the arguments that we've made. He wrote his own book, Mind and Cosmos, how the neo-Darwinian materialist explanation of reality is almost certainly false, I think was the subtitle. I'm indebted to him because he recommended my book for commendation with the Times Literary Supplement, and then continued to defend his choice in a very heated exchange of letters in that journal after it was published. I thought he'd want nothing more to do with the issue, and then 2 years later he came out with his own book. So he's a very interesting figure.
Well, it has been a blast having you on the podcast. I appreciate your work so much. We'll pray for you as you pray for us, and together we'll make a difference while there's yet time.